Hey everyone, how's it going? So the preseason is in full swing, expectations for the Detroit Lions are only getting higher, and today we have some important information that every fan needs to know. So make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you're not part of our community yet, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates. And I want to see you guys participating in the comments. Write "Go Lions" and also tell me what city and country you're watching this video from. It's always great to see our fan base coming together here and showing the strength of the Lions Nation around the world. Now, without wasting any time, let's get straight into the biggest news and the most important updates surrounding the Detroit Lions. Jackson Meeks is one of the most intriguing players to watch when the Detroit Lions take the field for their first preseason game against the Cincinnati Bengals, and the reason goes far beyond what he did at wide receiver last year. This is a player who has already shown that he can make an impact in preseason, but now he is entering a completely different situation after making a major position change. Last preseason, Meeks put together a strong performance, finishing with roughly 175 yards, multiple touchdowns, and double-digit catches. He showed the kind of physicality that immediately made him interesting, especially because of his size and ability to win physically. But as the regular season approached, the Lions started dealing with injuries at tight end, and suddenly Meeks became part of a much bigger conversation. Instead of simply trying to establish himself as another wide receiver, Detroit moved him to tight end, and this offseason Meeks took that transition seriously. He added 25 pounds and is now around 235 pounds. That gives him much more of the physical profile you want to see from a tight end, although there is still a question about whether he needs another 5 or 10 pounds, and perhaps even more importantly, what kind of weight he added. That is something we will learn much more about once he gets into a real game situation. The bigger question is where Meeks fits on this roster. Sam LaPorta remains the #1 tight end, while Tyler Conklin and Brock Wright are also part of the competition. That creates a very interesting battle for the remaining spots. With LaPorta's injury history, Brock Wright having dealt with injuries, and Conklin beginning the year on the PUP list before returning to action, the Lions could potentially have a reason to keep 4 tight ends. That is exactly why Meeks is worth watching. This isn't simply about having a good preseason game. He has an opportunity to show that his physical tools can translate to this new position and potentially give Detroit another reason to keep him around. Then there is Seth McLaughlin, and honestly, this is one of the most unexpected names to watch going into this game. McLaughlin was already someone worth knowing because of what he accomplished in college, where he was described as a former Remington Award winner for the nation's best center. The Lions brought him in as an undrafted free agent, and under normal circumstances, he might not have been expected to become one of the biggest offensive storylines heading into the first preseason game. But circumstances have changed. Cade Mays is dealing with a wrist injury, described in the source as a possible fracture in one of the bones in his wrist. At the same time, Detroit has Juice Scruggs, who was acquired in the David Montgomery trade. Scruggs has experience as an NFL backup, but the question raised here is whether he can establish himself as a reliable starter. That makes the center position one of the most interesting areas to watch, especially because the concern is that Detroit could enter the first month or two of the season facing a problem similar to the one from last year, having a center who has not completely established himself yet, and this is where McLaughlin gets his opportunity. The possibility of him surpassing Scruggs is something worth monitoring closely. McLaughlin reportedly received 2 or 3 practices with first-team repetitions, and he has said that he is finally 100% after his previous injury. The source describes that injury as an Achilles injury from around 2024 or 2025, and points out that without that injury, McLaughlin likely would have been drafted. Now he has a chance to show what he can do when the opportunity finally arrives. And then we get to Dominic Lovett, a player who may have been forgotten by some Lions fans, but absolutely should not be forgotten when watching this preseason game. Lovett was a 7th round pick 2 years ago, and with Detroit selecting Kendrick Law in the 5th round this year, it was easy to assume that Law could take Lovett's place in the competition. But Law suffered an ACL tear, and that completely changed the situation. Lovett now has something that players in the NFL rarely get, another real opportunity to establish himself. According to the information in the source, Lovett has flashed at times during camp, but the competition at wide receiver is crowded. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Isaac Tesla, and Darius Dork are expected to make the team, leaving the final spots to be fought over by Lovett, Cedric Wilson Jr., Tom Kennedy, Malik Cunningham, and several other players, including Lucky Jackson and Tariq Black. That means Lovett cannot afford to simply have an average preseason performance. He needs to make himself impossible to ignore. The question is whether he can take advantage of this unexpected second chance and create enough separation from the other receivers competing for those final roster spots. And finally, there is Luke Altmyer, and this could be one of the most important evaluations of the entire game because his performance will affect how much we can actually learn about the players around him. There was supposed to be an advantage for Detroit heading into the preseason because Teddy Bridgewater was expected to be the backup quarterback. Having an experienced backup meant the Lions could put their receivers, tight ends, and other offensive players on the field and get a much clearer evaluation of their talent. But Bridgewater retired, and now the Lions have to see whether Altmyer can operate the offense well enough to allow the players around him to be evaluated properly. That is the standard that should be applied to Altmyer. Nobody should expect him to walk onto the field and suddenly look like a superstar. The goal is much simpler. Can he command the offense? Can he make the right decisions? Can he put the ball in positions where the receivers and tight ends have a chance to show what they can do? If Altmyer can accomplish that, his performance becomes valuable even if the statistics aren't spectacular. There is also Jacob Sailors, who could put himself into the conversation for the third running back position. He had 33 kickoff returns last year and has already demonstrated value on special teams. But the question is whether he has enough burst, size, contact balance, and pass protection ability to become a legitimate third running back. Dan Campbell's comments about Sailors focused heavily on his intelligence, understanding of the system, conscientiousness, and increased comfort in camp. Campbell also said Sailors has the ability and that this is a great opportunity for him. But that is exactly what makes this competition interesting. Being smart and knowing the system can help you survive in an NFL training camp, but eventually you have to prove that you can physically handle the role. Sailors is competing for that opportunity, and he has to show whether he can be as effective as the third running back Detroit had last year, while also competing with players such as Jabari Small, Raheem Blackshear, and Kyle Roshaw. Roshaw in particular has already drawn attention after appearing on a Lions video with a strong run, showing a bigger and more powerful frame. So when you watch this first preseason game, don't just watch the stars. Watch the players fighting for their football lives. Watch Jackson Meeks and ask whether the move to tight end is beginning to make sense. Watch Seth McLaughlin and ask whether he can challenge Juice Scruggs at center. Watch Dominic Lovett and see whether he can take advantage of the opening created by Kendrick Law's injury. Watch Luke Altmyer and determine whether he can run the offense well enough to give the rest of the young players a fair evaluation. And watch Jacob Sailors to see whether he can prove that he deserves a roster spot beyond his special teams value. And remember, the source warns that the Bengals are expected to play their starters, so the beginning of this game could look rough for Detroit before things even out later. That makes these evaluations even more important, because preseason football is where we can start putting on our GM glasses and deciding which players are truly giving the Lions something worth keeping. Out of all these players, who do you think has the biggest opportunity to change his position on the Lions roster with this first preseason game? The biggest thing to remember here is that preseason football is not really about the final score. For these players, it is about creating evidence. Every snap matters because there are only so many opportunities to separate yourself from the competition, and several of these Lions players are entering this game with exactly that challenge in front of them. For Jackson Meeks, the challenge is especially interesting because his story is no longer simply about whether he can catch passes. We already know he has shown the ability to make plays in preseason. The question now is whether he can turn his physicality into something that works consistently at tight end. Moving from wide receiver to tight end and adding 25 pounds is a major change, and the first preseason game gives us a chance to see whether that experiment is beginning to produce something useful for Detroit. And if Meeks can make a few plays, block effectively, use his size, and show that he is becoming comfortable in the position, suddenly the conversation changes. Instead of asking whether the Lions should continue developing him, people start asking whether they can afford to leave him off the roster. That is exactly what preseason competition is supposed to create. The same thing applies to Seth McLaughlin. His situation may actually be one of the most important offensive evaluations of the night because center has become an unexpected question mark. Cade Mays' wrist injury has opened the door, and McLaughlin has already received first-team repetitions. Now he has to show that those practices were not just a temporary opportunity. He needs to demonstrate that he can operate the position against real competition and make the coaching staff think twice about who should be taking those snaps. That does not mean one preseason game suddenly determines the starting center. It means McLaughlin has been given an opportunity that he probably did not expect to have this early, and the smartest thing he can do is make the most of every snap, because once a player starts getting noticed by the coaching staff, the entire conversation can change. Then you have Dominic Lovett, and I think his situation is one that Lions fans should pay very close attention to. He was already facing a crowded wide receiver room, and the arrival of Kendrick Law appeared to make his path even more difficult. But Law's ACL injury changed that equation. Lovett now has another opportunity, and the source makes it clear that he has already flashed during training camp. The problem for Lovett is that flashing is not enough anymore. There are too many receivers competing for those final roster positions. If Amon-Ra St, Brown, Jameson Williams, Isaac Tesla,